do today is talk mostly about both the bottoms-up approach and the top-down approach that in so many of the projects that we've done has been, it took both of those things in order for the project to actually move forward. And I'm going to talk a lot about champions, and a few of our speakers have talked about the importance of champions, and I really want to try and highlight that throughout this presentation. But before I get into all that, I thought I would kind of take us back a little bit in history and talk about what the watershed used to be like before it became urbanized. So this is from 1854. Is there a, which one? There we go. Okay. So this is back from 1854, and the blue outline is roughly the watershed boundary today. But basically, it didn't even used to really be a creek for most of what it is today. It used to be a whole series of wetlands, and there was a very small section of the creek, and at that time it was called Todd Stream. And that was basically what existed back in 1854. So most of the landscape in that area would have been Garry Oak ecosystems. And First Nations, there was many village sites. This was it was part of their territories. They used the camas, which is the purple flower in the foreground there, as a major trading item, as a starch. And so it was a very, very important ecosystem. And Fort Victoria was established, and most of the area was cleared and channelized or drained for farming. So you can see the blue line that goes down the center. That's basically the beginning of Bowker Creek after it was a wetland and they channelized and started farming the area. And this continued on for a few decades. And then as urbanization continued, then they started having all sorts of problems with flooding and erosion and that sort of thing. And they started to bury the creek. They started to put the creek into pipes. And this was really happening through the late 50s and all through the 60s into the early 70s until the communities actually stood up against the municipal councils of the day and said, enough is enough. Stop putting this creek into a pipe. We actually want to protect this creek. So all the way back there, that is shows the importance of the community saying, hang on a second. We actually value this creek, even though there's problems. We value this creek and we want to try and maintain it. This is an image of the creek that goes through Shelburne Road. It basically is piped all under Shelburne Road in Victoria. And again, the blue line is showing where the creek at one point in time was. And as the watershed became more and more developed, and the entire watershed is now developed, completely developed, we saw what we see in all creeks, where we have a very significant response to urban development, and we see the flow and the hydrological regime significantly change. And then we see all sorts of issues with that. So this is a fairly common 1 in 10-year flood that happens on a reasonably regular basis, where a whole pile of rain will come down and all of it goes into the creek as quickly as possible, because that's how we developed land back then. We've got significant areas. This is kind of right in the middle of the watershed. Oops. Right in the middle of the watershed. It's an area that goes through Richmond School, and it is highly, highly eroded. The entire creek has a fence around it because it's an obvious safety hazard. And then, of course, we see some water quality issues as we create paved areas and hardened areas, and again, we're trying to engineer things so that it gets the water off the land as quickly as possible. And in the lower reaches of the creek, then they were basically forced to culverting and channelization. So any of the open sections of the creek often have a rock-lined wall or cement bags, basically, is the one image. And a lot of the watershed today is a culvert, or a lot of the creek today, I should say, is a culvert. So back in the late 90s, again, the community came forward to the regional district and the 3 local governments that are in this area and said, hey, we really need to do something here. We're losing this creek, we're losing a community amenity, and we would like to work together to bring this area back. At that time, the CRD was going through a watershed management planning process, and they were identifying a number of key watersheds in the region that there was a need to put together some sort of an integrated plan. And the Bowker Creek watershed was actually fairly far down the list because it was so highly degraded. They felt, you know, we kind of lost the battle on that one already. But again, the community stood up and said, no, we really do want some action to be taken in this area. And so they lobbied the politicians, they lobbied municipal staff, they lobbied regional government staff, and at the end of the day, the Bowker Creek watershed made it into the top 3 of watersheds that the CRD would then work together to develop a plan. And a couple of other watersheds happened first, and what they found was there was a great engagement process. They developed a watershed management plan. They had a whole list of actions, and various organizations were designated to be the lead on these various actions. And over time, as you know, staff moved on, or you know, one of the NGOs, their executive director, went to a new position, these documents became documents that just sat on a shelf. So when we got the Bowker Creek initiative going, we brought together about 50 different organizations and community associations and government organizations and institutional organizations to develop an overall watershed management plan. And as with most plans, you start out with some sort of a vision. So there had been a lot of work that went into a vision, and there's actually, if you look in the watershed management plan, there's an entire page that tells a story of what the community wants this watershed to look like in the future. And it talks about fish in the stream, it talks about ribbons of treed corridors that connect all of these valuable natural area spaces within the watershed. And of course, we couldn't really go out with a one-page vision, so we boiled it down to this vision that's up on the screen. And it's talking about the fact that we have human uses, we have natural areas, we want to manage all of these things so that we're minimizing the runoff and pollution. We want to see a healthy creek that supports wildlife and habitat. And we want this creek to be a community greenway and to provide a big amenity for our community. So with that, so that it didn't become a document that stood on a shelf, we then established the Bowker Creek Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder committee that's tasked with coordinating efforts to actually implement the watershed management plan. There's 3 municipalities, Saanich, Victoria, and Oak Bay. The regional district, the University of Victoria, they're up in the headwaters. Right up here is the University of Victoria. And then there's 6 community associations that operate within the watershed, and they also sit on our initiative, on the steering committee for that. And if we look at the watershed as a whole, there's approximately 30,000 residents that live within a 1,850 hectare watershed area. 56% is impervious, and any areas that aren't impervious are mostly clay soils, so they're pretty much impervious. 2/3 of the creek is now piped underground, and as I pointed out earlier, most of the open sections have been highly altered. So why would we start with that creek? Well, again, it was because the community wanted it. The community, even though it was as degraded as it is, the community still held value, And they wanted us to move forward with something. So then for a few years we did a whole bunch of studies and all these various different things, and we always had this watershed management plan, and the watershed management plan said things like, create a greenway. So as we know, development happens on a site-by-site basis, and so the municipal staff were having a real challenge in actually achieving the goals of the watershed management plan, because they said, yeah, we know you want a greenway, but how does this little site, this little development, how does that fit in with what your vision of the greenway is? Because without us knowing that, we can't ask for density bonusing, we can't ask for community amenities as part of our development process, because as most in local government will understand, there's only limited areas where the local government actually has any ability to kind of push things in a new direction. So we then decided, okay, we need to pull all of this stuff together in what we termed the blueprint. We were originally going to be doing an integrated stormwater management plan, but our committee and our community said, you know what, that's not enough. It can't just be about stormwater. It needs to be about habitat. It needs to be about greenways and creating connections. It needs to be about how do we connect these pieces, these small little pieces of habitat that we still have within this watershed. How do we connect all of those things together? So we were still being guided by the 4 watershed management plan goals. We had undergone a major engineering study to develop a master drainage plan that looked at the engineering solutions for flooding and erosion. And this is another, is Craig in the room, Craig Sutherland? I don't see him here today. So we worked with Kerwood Lydell on that, and this was back in 2006, and at that time I was trying to make the case to the engineers that we really needed to incorporate a climate change scenario, and at that time science was still, it wasn't quite there to say, here is how our climate is going to change in our area specifically. But we did manage after months of conversations, and it wasn't until the engineers from the consulting company said to the local government engineers, we do have to look at climate change, because in 20 years or in 50 years, our 1 in 200 year scenario is going to be our 1 in 100 year scenario. So finally we made that breakthrough, and all of the solutions, all of the engineering solutions are a climate adapted solution where they are looking at an increase in winter rainfall and a more extensive summer drought. We also looked at things like land use, low impact development, the creek corridor, the riparian areas, all of the environmental considerations. We also looked at social considerations. So what are the economic costs and benefits? We looked at greenways, we looked at recreation opportunities. And we pulled all of that together into a consolidated plan that we called the blueprint. So the blueprint is really about trying to illustrate a potential future for this watershed. And we put right into the title of the document that it's a 100-year vision. And the reason for that is that municipal staff were hesitant to take forward such an ambitious plan, because if you tried to figure out what the dollar amount was to actually implement the redevelopment of an entire watershed so that we can get the hydrological function back into the watershed, the costs of that were scary, to say the least. And no council who's in there for a 3 or a 4 year term wants to commit future councils to potentially millions of dollars worth of spending. So we had to really take a step back, and that's when we really started talking about, it took 100 years for us to get the watershed to this state it's going to take at least 100 years for us to fix that. The watershed itself is also at a opportunity for renewal because it's about to go through an entire redevelopment cycle. All of the housing stock was all built in, between the 40s and 60s, so everything is starting to turn over and be redeveloped. So that's why so much of the blueprint is about looking forward to those opportunities and being ready to take advantage of an opportunity when it presents itself. One of the things that we did was we tried to use a bunch of different kinds of illustrations to get across this vision without getting into detail where somebody could go in and say, oh my God, they want to put a creek right through my house. Again, that was something that was just not a comfortable place for the municipal staff or the elected officials for that matter to try and move forward. The plan also identifies shared responsibility and the need for collaboration and building relationships. It recommends watershed-wide management policy, planning, and a whole bunch of stewardship actions that need to occur at a watershed level. And it also recommends a series of site-specific actions for each section or reach of the creek. It provides a bunch of direction and information to municipalities and other landowners as well. So within the blueprint, there's tons and tons of actions, but we tried to actually boil those down into 9 key principles, and we said to municipal councils and staff, if all you take away from this is these 9 key principles, we're going to be in a better place, and I'll talk a little bit about those principles in a couple of minutes. We also wanted to identify key short-term priority actions that we would try and complete within the first 5 to 10 years. And most of those are going to be some of the projects that I talk about. Within it, there's also a monitoring program. And again, we tried to use images that would try to depict this vision. So one of the concepts that is well developed within the blueprint is a concept of green streets. And again, we wanted to have these ribbons of green streets as opposed to these ribbons of gray streets. And we even put in proposed green street sections to give them a visual of how could we actually do our roads differently so that we're not creating such an issue. So instead of doing our roads like we normally do, where we've got 2 or 3 or 4 lanes of traffic, the roads are crowned in the middle so that everything goes into these storm drains, and you might have a tree on a private property, maybe a boulevard tree. You may or may not have sidewalks and bike lanes, well, only if you can fit them in with all the cars. And so what we're suggesting is something different. Why don't we separate our vehicle lanes from our pedestrian cycling lanes using trees? And because we've already got some crowned roads, though that then automatically becomes kind of a tree well area where those trees can accept the rainwater that falls onto our roads and streets and utilize that and kind of get that hydrological function back. So there's a series of different principles, and we try to keep them super simple. Just use creek-friendly management approaches all the time throughout the entire watershed. Look at requirements to adopt to reduce effective impervious areas. So one of the municipalities, they have moved forward with implementing a stormwater utility. The first one in the capital region, and one of the speakers yesterday talked about, stormwater utilities are now a very common thing in the U.S. They're just starting to take on relevance, I guess, or prevalence here in Canada, and there's just this one in the region. So that's been a very interesting way that the municipality is saying, you know what, we actually think that we can operationalize the implementation of the blueprint by creating a stormwater utility, because then all new development has to look at how can they infiltrate and utilize the rainwater on the land. Another key thing was ensuring that the principles of the blueprint were incorporated into the municipal OCPs and land use plans and all of that sort of thing. And we've been very successful in ensuring that that has occurred, which as soon as it gets into that, then it kind of drives all of the development. And developers, they first go to the OCP and they say, okay, here's what I need to do. Municipal staff also do that. They refer back to the OCP and it says, well, here's what we're being directed to do. So as soon as now the Bowker Creek blueprint is within all of the OCPs of the 3 municipalities, and it's gradually making its way into local area plans. And things like purchasing and protecting key lands in the watersheds, I'll talk about that a little bit later, and including climate adaptation and mitigation in all activities. There's a series of reach-specific actions, so we have 17 reaches, both closed and open reaches. There's a whole bunch of different types of efforts. We look at what needs to be operationalized and what things might need to be opportunistic projects. It includes everything from invasive species removal and improvement of riparian habitats to upgrading or channel widening, creek daylighting, and greenways. And just so that you can see how it's set up for each reach, we have some mapping that shows the soils, it shows the land use, and then it's got a few images of the reach, and then it goes into the integrated actions for each section of the reach. There's a number of short-term actions, and I'm not going to go through this list because I'm already running out of time and I haven't even got to the good stuff. So I'm just going to blast through a couple of these, but we have essentially achieved 8 of the 10 short-term actions, and there's a couple more that we're still working on. One that I just want to point out is number 9, where we want to work with the creekside landowners between these 2 streets to achieve a long-term vision. And there's a large piece of property that's currently owned by BC Hydro, and they've identified that it's not the right size that they need for their needs. So the community has been very, very active in lobbying the local government to purchase this piece of property, and it appears as though that things are moving in that direction, which is great news, because that's going to be a critical piece of property for us to look at restorative land development. So, opportunistic projects. So the CRD operates the trunk sewers in this area. They had a sewer upgrade project where they had to build a new pump station, and it required them to cross the creek right at St. Pat's School. And we had a political champion who was a big fan of the Bowker Creek initiative, and at one board meeting where they were approving the budget for the sewer upgrade, he stood up and went, "Free Bowker!" And he made this impassioned plea to the board to also restore the creek. Since we were crossing the creek, it's incumbent upon us to restore the creek at that time. And it was because of that political champion that we were able to do our, kind of our first big restoration project as part of an opportunity for an engineering project that had to be done. So typical flooding events that happen in this reach of the creek. It was highly overgrown with invasive yellow willow. There was all sorts of, you can see that there had been some significant erosion over time. The creek bottom was about 5 meters wide, and in our summer low flows you might have like 2 or 3 centimeters of water. So one of the key things that we did was look at reducing the width of the creek, and created a series of planting benches. So we kind of narrowed it. We had to, of course, rock line the channel so that we wouldn't experience erosion. And then we created planting benches and worked with the school. So every student in the school came out and helped with the planting, and they now own that section of creek. And this actually was taken about, probably 6 years ago now. You go out there now and you can't even see the creek. It is so well grown in. Another one is the Cedarhill Tributary. So there's a 1.5 kilometer tributary that comes into the main stem of Bowker Creek. And it's in Cedarhill Park and Golf Course. So the golf course is over here. The creek is kind of these blue areas in here, and there's a ball field that is relatively underutilized. And especially in the winter, the groundwater actually comes above the surface there. So this area was identified in the blueprint as a critical area for storage because there's not a lot of pieces of land within, especially far up in the watershed, that we could create some level of storage in the watershed. Then all of a sudden, there was another group who came out of the woodwork and said, hey, we think that this would be an awesome spot to put 8 clay courts for tennis. And so they came to us and we had some discussions about what we had proposed. The blueprint had already been endorsed by Saanich Council. This is a project that was happening in Saanich. There was a lot of back and forth at the community hearings. There was 4 nights of public hearings. I think it was close to 500 people stood up and spoke. And at the end of the day, we submitted to council, here's what the blueprint that you guys recently endorsed says. Here's the opportunity. If the opportunity that is given to us is to work with the clay courts group to try and do some creek restoration, yes, that would be the opportunity, but we feel that there's a better opportunity here. And at the end of the day, the council unanimously supported the creek over the courts. So that was a big win. We're now working with the community and the district of Saanich to, we're coming up with a whole bunch of different restoration options so that we can really improve this area. And one of our biggest projects has been a collective partnership with the CRD, the District of Oak Bay, the Greater Victoria School District, Oak Bay High School, and the Bowker Creek Initiative to restore a section of the creek. And again, this is one of our short-term projects that we wanted to get done. So we knew that the school was slated to be rebuilt. And so we had early discussions with the school district about what the opportunities might be to restore the creek when they did that. We then worked with them on a feasibility study to determine whether or not we could do this section of the creek, because it's quite low down in the watershed prior to work happening in the upper parts of the creek. It was determined that it was engineeringly feasible for us to do that. And then we got funding, and we got $750,000 through an innovations grant, the federal provincial innovations grant. And the reason that we got the funding is because of the partnership that we had created as part of the project. So the creek used to just run in a channel. The bottom of the creek was actually the toe of the retaining wall, so it was totally cement. It was completely overgrown with yellow willow, blackberry, and a few other nasties. Again, it kind of comes through a box culvert before it gets into that section, regularly floods. This is a very common scenario. The downstream properties, many of them get flooded. So part of the project was we wanted to really connect the teachers and the school to the creek. So part of our grant project was we wanted to use the creek as a learning tool, and it really fit in well with the Water Smart goals of every grade 12 student will understand what a functioning creek looks like and all that sort of thing. So it's now, we worked with the school, they've developed all sorts of curriculum using the creek as a classroom. Science, English, social, geography classes. They're really focused on shifting to the 21st century education model, which is generalized instructions but individual learning opportunities, and really getting students connected to things and letting them run with it. Critical to this process has been Derek Shrubsole, who's our teacher champion. He has been the liaison with the school. He's gotten the students excited. They have done all sorts of amazing projects where his science classes now will come out and they'll work with us on maintaining the site. They come out and do vegetation transects before and after, and they've been continuing to do that. They actually got involved with an international conference and exchange program, Water is Life, where they hosted a school from, I think it was the Netherlands, and they came and studied our creek, and then they went to the Netherlands and went and studied their creek, and then they're sharing all this water quality and vegetation data back and forth, and they're part of the long-term monitoring program for the creek. We also got the students involved and the whole school involved in a design charrette to say, what do you guys want this creek to look like? So it was a really interactive workshop. We kind of had two teams. We had community members, we had elected officials, we had staff from the district, the school district, everywhere, teachers and students, and we did some visioning stuff. Then one of the students actually drew this classroom because they decided they wanted an outdoor classroom in the bank of the creek. And the final design of the classroom is very, very close to the image that this student had drawn as part of that. So we wanted to ensure that we were safely conveying the flows. We wanted to improve the aquatic and riparian habitat quality. We wanted to really create an outdoor learning and public education space, having public access and the greenway, and of course we wanted to try and do it within budget, and we had to ensure the minimization of the maintenance that was required. So very quickly, just kind of take you through, we had to completely divert the creek around. We were not able to remove the cement wall that's the retaining wall for the track. So one of the things that we did instead of removing the wall was we created 3 benches basically that were tied into the wall, and we could use those to create habitat, wildlife refugia, and also to create a meander in the stream so that it wasn't continuing to be just a straight creek. You can see the classroom being kind of roughed out in this area, and because it's a really, really flashy creek, one of the things that happened during the construction is we had a 1 in 200 year storm event on July 17th, which we never have. And we have water monitoring and level sensors on the creek. And in 10 minutes time, 10 minutes, the level of the creek went from 3 inches to 43 inches in 10 minutes. That's how quickly and how well engineered this watershed is to get the water off the land as quickly as possible. And this is kind of what the creek looks like now. So I have, hopefully, it will work for me, a little time-lapse video just showing it. We had a lot of cloudy days that July. You can see coming up here the big storm event. There. Yeah, talk about stress level. Like, it's still raining, oh my God. Hello, fisheries. We may have had a sediment release. So is this not stopping or what? There's another rainfall event. There we go. So it was a huge partnership. We had teacher champions, we had student champions, we had consultant champions, like part of the consulting team. They went to high school there, and they knew how degraded that part of the creek had become, and it was their pleasure to be part of fixing that section of the creek. There's another upcoming opportunity, so There's 3 schools in our watershed, and the creek goes through all 3 of them. And this is Richmond School. I had already showed some pictures of that, where it's the most eroded portion of the creek. Most of it is invasive. It's a public hazard. And so within the blueprint, sometimes we just said, look, here's the potential. So that's actually the image that's in the blueprint. Let's just move the creek and actually create something so that the school district gets the whole piece of their land back and the community gets an amenity back. So we've now gone to the school district and based on the success of the Oak Bay High School restoration, we're saying, look, why doesn't the school district also endorse the blueprint? You guys start implementing the principles and stuff, and let's look at options to explore how can we now do a similar type of project in Richmond school land so that we can fix that section of the creek. And they did endorse the blueprint, and we're now having discussions about what the potentials are for that area. We've talked a fair bit about, or lots of people have talked about, the importance of educating students. And this was a quote from the principal who was involved in the project, and I think it is such an important quote. It talks about that land ethic where, our shifting baseline. Because what he says is a young person's surroundings are a silent educator, and the best way to inoculate a sense of environmental responsibility and stewardship in youth is to model it. So allowing an important waterway to pass through our property in a ditch silently teaches students that the environment doesn't really matter, whereas a rehabilitated and healthy creek with safe and reasonable access speaks volumes about how one should value the environment. And I think that we've really, really accomplished that on that specific site. But sometimes you just got to go underground, and in Bowker Creek, when you go underground, you go into a concrete creek. And again, shout out to the community, because only the community would say, hey, let's go out on Saturday morning and let's go jump all those fences and just actually walk the entire creek. And so we did. There's an interesting underground life, literally, that happens within Bowker Creek underneath Hillside Mall. There were some terrifying things, though, as we went through. So that's a natural gas line. Look at the condition of that. It's like, oh my Lord. Wonder where some of those contaminants come from. Wherever there was the slightest bit of light getting in, even in a concrete creek, there was stuff trying to grow there. That blew my mind. So sometimes you have to go underground, and other speakers have talked about timing, and sometimes you just have to wait for the time is right. And sometimes you just strategically have to wait until a certain individual retires before you can actually move something forward. So the one piece that we were not able to achieve as part of the blueprint was to do a daylighting feasibility study, because the individual who sat on our committee had spent their entire career as the underground engineer, and their only lens was getting the water off the land as quickly as possible. And the concept of taking all of that out of a pipe was simply foreign. And we were not able to move forward with a daylighting feasibility study until that individual retired. We're just in the process of working with the consulting team to define a route for daylighting all closed sections of the creek. And that includes the area that is under Shelburne. It's very unlikely that we will daylight the creek through Shelburne, like underneath Shelburne, but we're looking at where could we potentially move it to maybe a side street where we would, over time, be able to get the properties that we need in order to do it. The community again came forward and said, hey, not only do we need to look at that, but we also need to look at the greenway. So now the project is looking at the greenway routing and the daylighting routings for all closed sections of the creek. As part of that, there's going to be some areas that are, the constraints are just going to be too much for us to actually daylight the entire creek. So one of the things we've asked the consultants to do is also look at areas where we could create large detention areas. So the BC Hydrolands is now coming up. The Cedarhill Tributary, looking at how large a wetland could we create in that area so that we can really hold back some of the flows. And again, it's the phase of redevelopment, because as we participated in the Shelburne Valley Corridor Plan, where they were looking at how do we redo this street, when we started that process, they didn't even have the creek labeled on any of their maps. By the end of that process, there's all sorts of statements within that talk about density bonusing and amenities, so that when they're working with the development community, they can get areas of land so that over time, over the next 50 years or something, we can start actually daylighting the creek. But without the actual daylighted route, nobody, no municipal staff can actually have those conversations with developers, because they don't know how that piece fits in with the overall vision. So this was the last big piece, was to do the daylighting feasibility, and we're very, very excited. We still meet a lot of resistance, and some of you have seen this already. If they can remove, what is that, an 8-lane double-stacked highway from the middle of Chiangrai in Korea, I think we can do it with Bowker Creek. It's not a big problem. So, what are some of our currents of success? Having a coordinator dedicated. So local government staff, they've got a million priorities. And having a coordinator, that's one person whose job it is to try and keep us moving forward in the implementation of the blueprint and implementation of the watershed management plan. It's a huge thing. Staying on track and keeping focus. The number of times that we've had to step back and go, how does that fit with this vision? Or is this still our vision? And that has been able to kind of get us back on track on numerous times. We spent a lot of the first few years really focusing on outreach efforts and working with the community. The community has been absolutely fantastic in helping to deliver the outreach and talking to their neighbors about the importance of the creek. And, oh, hey, did you actually know that there's a creek that runs under this street? Most people didn't know that. Now, everybody knows that. And the community is engaged. The community goes and they talk to the politicians, and the politicians are the ones that are now in front of that parade. You have to engage the community. You have to engage the politicians. You need champions at every single level. You need community champions. You need local government staff champions. You need political champions. You need funding champions. The champions, for the last 2 days, the song, Queen, We Are the Champions, has just been going through my head and through my head and through my head and through my head, because without those champions, we would have never achieved the success that we have. And, as I hope I've pointed out, you need the bottoms up and the top down approach in order for us to move forward. Thank you.